Hello, my name is Eric Winkelspecht. I'm a software engineer, and this is the next entry in my Learning Out Loud video series, where I'm talking about current or past projects and looking at the code that makes them work. So we'll be looking at the Kanban task tracker application today. It's a front-end mentor challenge. When we last reviewed this, we had just gone through and set up CSS code and set up our variables, and we made a few of the on-page elements. So since that point, we've done a few more of the elements. So we have an add task form here, just making this look the way it should, and it still has the different themes. And we have an add board and a delete modal. So those are fun, but not really what I want to look at today. What I do want to look at today is where we are with making this stuff actually start to function the way it's supposed to function and passing down all the information. So I just uncommented a map function that I have going on here. And we'll go through all these step by step, but I want to talk about first the data that was provided as part of this challenge. So if we go look at this data.json file, this is one just big object in this, and within this object we have a bunch of individual objects or arrays of objects. So we can see we have one gigantic object which says we have a boards array, and within that boards array we have the boards objects, which have a name, and they have columns, which is an array of, let's say, tasks, right, which they have a name, and the tasks has an array of the individual tasks. So this is a task object, and within that task object we have title, description, status, and then we have a subtasks object, which is an array of individual subtasks. So there's a whole lot going on here, but we can break this down and make this a little less confusing. And I'm building this project in React, and I'm using TypeScript. So when using TypeScript, you want to create your types, right? You want to declare what your types are. So that way when you're doing things like passing down props or mapping through objects or mapping through arrays, or taking key value pairs of objects, you can rely on a type to give you that little IntelliSense pop-up that'll help you make sure you're selecting the right name when we don't have any typos, which will prevent some silly errors from going on. IntelliSense on this is really nice, just because I don't have to keep going back and referring to the objects. It has a little pop-up of what I'm typing in. So we'll look at that in a second too. But first I want to look at the interface that we declared. So I made this just in one file, and we can compare it to our JSON file. And let's actually go full screen on this so we can see everything we're looking at here. So I think this helps if we break this down into the smallest component first. So let's look at these subtasks, right? So we know that actually if we look at, let's look at the Figma file, right? Just to give us a visual of how these things are going to work out for us. So let's go to one of the desktop views because it's a little bit bigger. So we can see on our main board here, right, we've got our overall board, and this one is called Platform Launch. We can see on the little sub-menu or sliding menu to the side on this view, these are individual boards, right? Platform Launch, Marketing Plan, Roadmap. If we go back and we look at our boards, Platform Launch, right? We have a lot of information in Platform Launch. Here's Marketing Plan, right? So we can see those things starting to line up. And within each of those boards, we have our columns, like here, to do. Let's move this in the center a little bit more. To do, doing, and done in this case of Platform Launch. Within each of those columns, we have our primary tasks, build UI for onboarding flow, build UI for search. And then within each of those primary tasks, we can open that up and see a list of subtasks, right? So we can at least see the general flow of how all this information is going to appear on the screen, which is helpful. And looking at our data here and the types that we have declared, let's look at subtask first, right? Our smallest component of all this stuff. And we know we've got subtasks, and each subtask has a title, which in this case is sign up page, and is completed and is going to be a Boolean true or false. So we make that type subtask with title and is completed. Title is string, is completed as a Boolean true or false. Now we move up in my case, and then I make the tasks object or type. And the tasks type we have here is an object which has a title, which we got from here, a string, description, which is also a string, status, which is also a string, and the subtasks, which is an array of our subtask type. Our columns type, we have the name, which is a string, and then we have our array of tasks, task type. Same thing with board, name, which is a string, the columns is column type, and then I have one big thing for boards, which is an array of boards. So those are our types. And as we utilize these types, so I've got them imported here, which in this case right now first, all I'm doing is we have the data, which I've from the JSON file, which I've just imported as data. And in this case, I'm just using data.boards because that's what we've got right here, that boards of our object. And we're mapping over that. And for every board within that array, here's our array, with every board within that array, we're going to return what I've called the board view. That's a component. And we're passing in that board. And we're also listing a key, right? Or with React, we always want to list a key if we're mapping through and rendering multiple elements, because that's how React keeps track of those elements. So let's look at board view and let's see what we've got going on. So we open up board view, and not too much actual code in here, right? But we are passing in our board prop, and up top here we're declaring our props type. You know, another TypeScript thing, if you're not familiar with TypeScript, if you're just using regular JavaScript, you wouldn't be declaring these types. This wouldn't be over here next to your prop. And I always like to break down my props into their actual names rather than just listing prop and do prop dot whatever, destructure them. So we declare a props type, which in our case that props type just consists of board, which is a board type from our other file. This is just confusing going back and forth, I know. But then we bring in our board.name, and here's where we can start seeing IntelliSense, right? So if I were to say, give me that h1, and start typing in board, and oops, sorry, let me actually use that board dot. Now it gives me my columns and name, which on our right-hand side, if we look at our board type, we have name and columns. So I can't make an incorrect selection here, or I mean, if I completely ignore this, but this helps me make the appropriate selection for that actual element I'm bringing in for the data I'm bringing in. So we declare our board name, and we're going to map through the different columns within that board, right? So here is our board name, and then the columns within that board that we're mapping through. So let's bring this back onto the screen, right? And we can move this to the bottom. We want to continue to reference our types over here. So board view. Now this isn't looking very pretty over here, but my board view is just stacked top to bottom right now, just as I kind of moved all of my data through all of my components here and made them render appropriately. So we see our platform launch board with our to-do column, right? Let's look at the data. Platform launch board with our first column named to-do, and we have some tasks in there. And then our second column, doing, is here, right? And that's mapping out some of the tasks. So we know we've at least got our board name, and then we map through each of those individual columns. Excellent, that's working fine. So let's go look at the actual column component that we're rendering here. And within column, we're just passing in each of those column names, right? Or column data. Here we have our props type. Column is columns. To structure it here. We list our column name to do, column tasks. Here are our individual tasks. And we're rendering our component task preview card, where we pass in each of those tasks that we're mapping, all that data, and we give it a key. And within our task preview card, let's open that particular component. This is where we have some more fun stuff going on. So again, we have our type that we're passing in is task tasks from our interface file here that we declared these types in. And we have all the fun Typescript in there to help us out to understand what this contains, right? So this in here, before I did all this passing down of props, this was just static data, right? But in here we have a heading, which is just being populated with task.title. So we can see each of our titles populating on this task preview card appropriately. And then the Figma file told us that we wanted to have a 1 of 3, 0 of 1, 0 of 2 subtasks. It wants to show us in a very quick view how many subtasks we have completed. So to do that, which this is the logic I have right now, maybe it'll change in the future, but it's working, so why bother? I have a function here where we pass in the subtask array, and we set a variable of count, which is 0. And then for each of the subtasks, we loop through, and if the status of that subtask is completed, if that evaluates to true, then add to count. Which actually, I can get rid of this and just say if completed, if is completed, because that's still a truthy value, right? So if is completed, add to count, then we return count, and then we see we have in our subheading down here, we're rendering, we have our count, which is just the tasks.subtasks.length, which is just how many elements are in that subtasks array. And then we are calling our completed function with task.subtasks, so we can loop through that array and get our count of how many are set to completed. Whew, that's a lot going on. Cool. The other thing we have going on in this preview card file is where we've got useState going on here, and you can see I've got a const visible and set visible for my useState here. And all this is doing is if we click on our preview card, which this is my div wrapper for my preview card, where all this stuff is contained. If we click on that, it takes our visible variable, which is just a Boolean true or false, and it's going to update it to whatever the opposite of it is. And when we have visible set to true, then we're going to render this task view card component. And we're passing in a bunch of props here. The task, completed, how many we've actually found if they're completed, the count, we're passing in visible and set visible. So let's click on one of these and we get to see this pop up, right? Let's look at another one. Let's see. This says 1 of 3 completed. So we can see we've got the 1 completed and 2 more. Let's click on this. 2 completed and 1 more. So how is this actually working? The click and making that visible, right? So as soon as I click, we call that set visible function, which updates visible to, for this particular preview card, is the task view card component we have listed here, is that visible or not? It's not. We click on it, it sets it to visible, and now it displays on the screen. Let's look at task view card. And there's a decent amount going on in here as well, which we have, again, our props type for everything that we're passing in. This is pretty simple, right? We've got our tasks, which we know we've declared in our other file. We passed in completed, which is just a number. We're passing in count, which is just a number. We're passing in visible, which is just a true or false. And then we have set visible. And this is the fun stuff that is a little challenging when using TypeScript with React. But typically, if you are passing in a function, let's say, such as this, if I haven't actually listed it over there in our props type or haven't set this up correctly, if I hover over this, you can see on our little pop-up here, it does say, gives us that error where it says, hey, we don't know what kind of type this is over there. And you see the react.dispatch, react set state action boolean. We're just pulling that exactly, copying and pasting into our props type over here. So those are fun, but no need to memorize them. TypeScript's going to give you exactly what you need to import that information. So let's look at the actual task view card element we've got here. So there's all the props that we've passed in. We've got all the information from that particular task waiting for us here. We know our completed number. We know our count, total count of subtasks, and same thing, we're passing in that visible and set visible. So we can minimize that so we get a little more room here. Here is the actual render of everything. I've got a background. I've got a div that's just called modal background, ID of modal background. That is allowing us to click on the elements here, but if we click out and onto that background, it's going to close that task view card, right? And all it's doing is if I'm clicking on that background, we call our set visible function. We set it to whatever the opposite of visible is, which we know in this case visible is true. We click, it sets to false, and it makes this whole thing disappear because that information lives on the preview card, and that's what's controlling the visibility here. And then we had the way I set all these up originally, this particular element, this preview card, was featured in the last Kanban Learning Out Loud video. And you can see we had static information on this element. And now we're just replacing that static information with all of our passed down prop information, right? So, and to kind of show off a little bit of that TypeScript autocomplete or IntelliSense, we had task dot, and then you can see my elements that are on task. We have description, we have status, we have our subtasks, we have our title, right? So I can just select now from there and get my title or my description. So we've got task.title, build UI for onboarding flow, which is great. Task.description. In this case, this particular one doesn't have a description associated with it. That's okay. And then we have down here our subtasks, which we already calculated, completed on the preview card, so we just passed that over. Same thing with our total count. We've just passed that over, which is rendering right here. And then we map through our subtasks. So task.subtasks, we map through for each subtask. We return, we have a subtask component, and we pass in that particular subtask, which is just being rendered, right? So we can look at the subtask component, subtask item, where we, same thing, we have declared our props type, which we are getting a subtask, which is the subtask type that we made in our interface file here. And then we can pass in subtask.isCompleted, which we're using that to determine if this should be checked or not. So you can see this is already checked because isCompleted is set to true. For the rest of those, incompleted is set to false, so that is not checked, right? Here is our ternary operator. So we say checked equals if subtask.isCompleted evaluates to, well, this says, is subtask.completed true? question mark. If it is, we return true, then checked would equal true. If it's not, we return false, then checked equals false. That's basically, if you're unfamiliar with ternary operators, this is just a very simplistic if statement. If this, then this, otherwise do this. And we pass in our subtask.title. So a lot of setup originally for what we did so far. Declaring all of our types and exporting them from this file, making sure all that looked good, and then just a lot of prop drilling at this point. We have our gigantic object of all of our data up front, and then we just pass down individual pieces of that through these components, and are rendering them on screen. I do want to look at real quick some of the CSS behind this particular pop-up, right? We already know it makes this visible. When I click on this, why that pops up? Because we set visible to true, and that allows it to render. But if we look at the CSS, I still have the scrolling back here, and as we scroll, this is just staying in the middle of our screen, right? And until we click, it's not going away. So the way we've done this here is, let's actually move our CSS to the bottom, and let's go look at our task preview card. So we saw before, task view card. So we saw before we have our background here, modal background, which is just a div, and we have our onClick there, which has an ID of modal background. So in my CSS, if I scroll through, I've got my ID modal background here, right? And we have this as position fixed. So position fixed is just going to pull this out of the actual top to bottom HTML stack, if you want to think of it that way. Completely removes it from when it would be relative position normally, right? And we're just saying that this particular div, which is modal background, has a height and width of just 100%. Actually, this isn't necessary, so we could take that out, because I originally had it as an absolute, but it didn't make sense. So fixed, which means fixed is going to be as we scroll, this element's not going to move, right? If this was an absolute element, which is what I had originally, right, which is going to mean when we scroll, now we see we lose that background, and it starts to scroll with the rest of the page, which we don't want. So we had that as fixed. So now as we scroll, that stays exactly in position. Doesn't matter where anything else is. Doesn't matter where that is in position with the rest of the HTML elements. It's just fixed now. You tend to use fixed for things like sidebars that you want to stay with the page as you scroll, or nav bars on the top, right? And all this is height and width of 100%. Our background color is just black with, the opacity turned down. We're at 0.3. And actually, I can get rid of this as well. I had this wrapping around my component, but the clicking wasn't working correctly and z-index wasn't cooperating. So instead, we just made it a separate div that's just going to live there on its own. So that we have now is our background fixed. And we also have a modal class that's doing the same kind of thing. So modal class, which I'm adding to anything that's going to be a modal pop-up, right? Which we can see on my task view card, which this div is the actual card itself we're looking at. Right? Let's click into another one. It has a few more elements just so we can kind of get a better feel here. This entire white square is our task view card div, that ID, and within that we give it the class of theme, which allows for that theme color switching we looked at last time as well, and the modal class, which is just the same thing, position fixed, so no matter where I scroll, that's what's appearing now. And this top 50, left 50, transform, translate, -50, -50 is just a fun little trick to center the elements in the middle of the screen. You might be familiar with your display flex and justify content center and align item center, which does this in effect, but without wrapping this in some other element that is display flex. This just allows us to have a fixed or absolute positioned element and center it on the screen. So that's all that. And we see that our change theme button is here on the bottom. That's still working. We have our pop-ups, and they also still work with the different themes that we have set up here. So this is where we're at right now. I'm super happy with just how smoothly this is all going so far. Of course, this is all just still working with a static JSON file for our data. Eventually, we are going to build out a backend for this thing so we can have this update and live on a server, and we'll build out all the functionality of actually updating each of these tasks. I was researching the drag and drop functionality. The browser has a built-in API that we could write our own thing. The mobile view would be different because phones and tablets don't use the same drag and drop API as a desktop browser would use. We could write something for that. There's also libraries that already exist. I was looking at React Beautiful D&D as one of them. It's already built out for me. It's got the functionality we need. It's got the animations in it, and things move around as we reassign elements in their columns. So we'll probably just be researching that a little bit more and use that library as part of this to save me a lot of development time and just make this thing work the way we want it to work. The coding community has so many resources available that are just go ahead and use it for your project because someone worked on this thing and it's a fantastic resource. Make sure you're exploring those options and do your research and see what's out there. You can challenge yourself, of course, to build all of the functionality that you need, and you can absolutely make that work. But if you don't need to for some specific reason, and there are libraries that will help you get the job done in a much more concise fashion and much faster, why not go ahead and rely on the work of others? But don't ever think that things are just magic. Do your research and understand what's going on the back end, why those things are working the way that they're working. I like to look at Bootstrap as an example. Bootstrap is an extremely popular library for various bootcamp style courses to use or to teach. Bootcamp is not magic, right? It's just predefined CSS classes. Just like this .modal utility class that I have listed here, CSS is a lot of that. And CSS primarily relies on things like display flex for positioning elements, and learning CSS and understanding that gives you a lot more freedom, in my opinion, to make elements the way you want them to look, not just styling, but positioning, media queries, all that stuff. So don't just accept any of it as magic. It all works for a very specific reason. I understand that. Anyway, I'm rambling. This is where we're at right now. Stay tuned for more updates on our Kanban tracker app.